Thank you for joining us for this MSF Operation Briefing Series, The Focus. My name is Ji-hyun Bang, and I work at the Communication Department of MSF Korea's office. First of all, I would like to inform you that we are providing simultaneous interpretation in Korean and English for today's event. Please press the interpretation button at the bottom of the screen to switch between Korean and English, your language of preference. As an international medical aid organization, MSF works in humanitarian crises around the world, including armed conflicts, epidemics, natural disasters, and medically underserved areas. These quarterly focused webinars are designed to highlight the ongoing or under-the-radar crises and share information about MSF's response efforts around the world. For our second briefing of the year, we are going to cover the 2014 largest Ebola crisis, which occurred 10 years ago. With more than 30,000 infections and 10,000 deaths, the Ebola epidemic was the largest infectious disease to shock the world before COVID-19. Unlike COVID-19, it did not become a global epidemic, but its fatality rate was up to 90%. Causing countries to shut down their borders to keep people out, which caused severe challenges to carry out humanitarian relief operations. Our guest for this briefing is Emma Campbell, who is currently the Executive Director of MSF Korea's office, and she was one of the MSF aid workers in Sierra Leone, one of the countries that was the most affected by the 2014 Ebola epidemic. We have her in person. Before we begin, we will watch a short video introducing the Ebola virus because some of you might not be familiar with it. So we'll cover the epidemic, the past decade, in the video clip for your reference. Let's watch this video clip together and then listen to Executive Director Campbell's presentation. While you listen to the presentation, if you have any questions, please feel free to leave them in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and we'll try to answer them in the Q&A session after the presentation in live. So let's watch the short video clip and come back.
Hi, my name is Emma Campbell, and I am the Executive Director of MSF Korea. And 10 years ago, in 2014, I went to Sierra Leone with MSF to be the HR and Finance Administrator across two different Ebola treatment centers. Normally for MSF, when we do these types of events, our focus is our patients, and that's absolutely right. It's what MSF is all about. But when I was in the field as an HR and finance administrator, my contact was mainly with our MSF staff. And this presentation is going to take a slightly different track to normal by focusing on our staff rather than on our patients and talking about our staff's experience in this crisis. I want to talk to you about the deep impact that working in the West Africa Ebola epidemic had on our staff and the impact that public attitudes to the epidemic had on many of my colleagues. And I want to reflect a little on the consequences of that experience for the humanitarian medical response to the Ebola crisis. Let's start with some basic facts and some background. The Ebola virus started in 1976 with two outbreaks in Sudan and the Democratic Republic. And since then, there have been around 20 outbreaks in Central Africa. There are 5 different strains, the Zaire strain being the most virulent. And this was the strain of Ebola in the West Africa Ebola epidemic. Scientists think that people are initially infected with an Ebola virus through contact with an infected animal, such as a fruit bat or non-human primate. And this is called a spillover event. And after that, the virus spreads from person to person, potentially affecting many people, like we saw in the West Africa crisis. Primary signs and symptoms of Ebola often include fever, aches and pains, weakness and fatigue, sore throat, and loss of appetite. They're quite like many common illnesses that we already see, such as influenza, malaria, or typhoid fever, and this can create challenges in diagnosing early on. But it also leads to much more serious symptoms, including gastrointestinal symptoms such as abdominal pain, diarrhea, and vomiting, unexplained hemorrhaging, bleeding, or bruising, and other symptoms such as red eyes, skin rash, and hiccups. It's a frightening, terrifying disease, perhaps one of the most feared diseases in the world, with a 90 or up to a 90% mortality rate. In March 2014, MSF's Geneva office was informed of a mysterious disease reported by the Ministry of Health in Guinea, which had symptoms similar to Ebola. Experienced MSF teams were deployed at once, and by the end of March, it was confirmed as Ebola. And it soon dawned on MSF that the spread this time was something that MSF had never seen before. Past outbreaks had been in Central and Eastern Africa and were more easily contained, mostly taking place in remote villages. But this Ebola outbreak erupted at the junction of Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone, where people regularly moved across porous borders and people lived in much higher densities. There was also real fear and suspicion of this unknown virus, something that hadn't been seen in this area before. And there were different types of burial practices that were very unsafe in the context of Ebola. High mistrust in politicians in this previous conflict zone, the hiding of cases, and a weak public health system which lacked the resources to recognize and efficiently respond to Ebola. And this all contributed to the surging of the virus through the region, and the epidemic rapidly overwhelmed health systems. In June of that year, MSF declared that the epidemic was out of control. We couldn't respond, and we were calling for qualified medical staff to be deployed from across the world. We called for more medical staff, for trainings, and for related activities to be stepped up. But none of these things happened following our appeal for help. And one of our medical colleagues described this as like shouting into a desert. MSF was accused of alarmism, with the governments of Guinea and Sierra Leone reluctant to recognize the severity of the outbreak, and members of the WHO in Guinea and Sierra Leone downplayed the epidemic spread, insisting that it was under control and accusing MSF of causing unnecessary panic. In Guinea, it was even reported that the president had suggested that MSF was deliberately spreading panic in order to raise funds. But by July and August, the number of people who had died were in their thousands, and MSF staff were talking about the situation as indescribable horror. Across those 3 countries, local healthcare workers were tragically dying by the dozens. In Ebola outbreaks, health facilities without proper infection control acted as multiplying chambers for the virus and became dangerous places for both health workers and patients. In July in Liberia, 2 Samaritans Purse staff, an US NGO, and US nationals became infected with Ebola, and the organization stopped working in the only 2 Ebola treatment centers in Liberia. No one stepped forward to take their place. And so MSF decided that we had to step up and for the first time send people from MSF who were not experienced in treating Ebola. By the end of August of 2014, the stories were shocking. The MSF Ebola Management Center in Liberia could only be open for new patients for 30 minutes each morning. Only a few patients could be admitted to fill the beds that had been made empty by the people who died the night before. People were dying on the gravel outside of the gates, and people were being turned away. The MSF staff took in the most that they could safely bring in, and the sickest. The turning point happened when Ebola crossed the ocean, when one of those US doctors working for Samaritan's Purse tested positive and was evacuated back to the US for medical care, and a nurse treating him was infected. Now the world began to wake up. Remember from that earlier slide, in that 34 period since Ebola was first discovered, only 2,300 or so people had been infected. But during this crisis, 2014 to 2016, nearly 29,000 people were infected with Ebola. So you can see the scale of this crisis. And the response had to be huge. Isolation and care for patients through Ebola treatment centers, staffed by trained personnel to provide medical care, and also psychosocial support for patients and their families. We had to help with safe burials. We had to do awareness raising to help communities understand the nature of the disease and how to protect themselves. We needed to do disease surveillance to locate new cases and do contact tracing to find people who'd been in contact with Ebola infected people so that they could get help. But remember, we were working in countries like Sierra Leone where MSF was already located to work with existing health crises, such as malaria, chronic disease, and care for mothers and babies. So this also had to happen at the same time whilst dealing with this challenge of the Ebola epidemic. Behind this, though, was also a huge amount of support work. And I want to emphasize that MSF recruits not only medical staff, but also logisticians and administrators. We needed to build those treatment centers to fix our communications and power, to have a cold chain for the drugs and pharmaceuticals. We needed waste disposal and good water and sanitation. And we needed to recruit staff, pay their salaries. I recruited many hundreds of staff whilst I was working there. We even needed to work with the media and, of course, work closely with the government of the countries that we were working in. I want to share one thing I did when I was there as an HR and admin manager. Whilst working in the Bow Medical Center, our national staff had been promised by their government a bonus to recognize their incredible contribution and bravery. But the government did not follow up on that promise. And so our national staff decided to carry out a strike, some industrial action. And during that time, I worked with our project coordinator and our head of mission to negotiate with the government and the staff to try and get them to return to work and try and find a solution. We managed to do that by MSF first paying the bonus, and then we would get it from the government because the healthcare workers really trusted MSF to deliver that support. So I was able to make a huge contribution. But it was an extraordinary time because during that strike, we weren't able to treat our patients. And it's perhaps the only time in my life working in HR that my decisions and my work really had people's lives depending upon it. And this is something that I will carry with me for the rest of my career with pride and with a sense of the extraordinariness of that particular situation. The WHO is normally internationally mandated to lead on global health emergencies, and they should have the know-how to bring Ebola under control, but they did not identify early the need for more staff, and they did not mobilize additional human resources. Meanwhile, in Liberia and Guinea and Sierra Leone, exhausted national health workers in the impacted countries were bravely and tirelessly working to continually tackle the outbreak each day, whilst often being infected themselves and facing stigma and fear in their own communities. For MSF, we had a huge limitation because we only had a very small number of Ebola experienced staff, just 40 at the outset. So we had to very quickly set up and run operations on the front line, but also train and coach many inexperienced medical and other staff. In that first year, MSF sent more than 1,300 international staff. And I'd deployed or recruited 4,000 national staff from the countries that we were working and worked alongside many Ministry of Health and other workers, such as ambulance people and burial workers. It was an incredibly difficult time for all our healthcare workers. Even within MSF, an organization with a higher tolerance of risk than many other aid agencies, Ebola was considered especially hazardous. The lack of treatments available to infected staff and the high mortality rate created a high level of fear amongst our staff. Medical evacuations for international staff could not be guaranteed by their respective governments, and staff volunteering to go to West Africa had to accept that they may fall sick and be unable to return home. I remember very clearly when I had my pre-departure briefing in Australia. The staff in Australia told me, do not expect the MSF Australia, the Australian government, to take care of you or bring you home if you are infected with Ebola. And this was something that I had to accept and be ready to deal with and decide to live with that if I went to the field. In my view, this was really shocking by the Australian government, but it was something that we had to live with when we made our choice to volunteer and go to Sierra Leone. For those who were interacting with our patients, they really faced extraordinary challenges. Fear of staff infections meant that MSF insisted on really stringent safety protocols, and that meant that staff had very limited time in the high-risk zone. And they couldn't often provide the quality of care for patients that they would have wanted, and this caused a lot of upset and anguish amongst the local and international MSF medical staff. It was in the 30 degrees and incredibly humid, and they were wearing these protective suits that were not breathable because it's made not to be absorbent. They could only stay in that suit for 1 hour and then they had to come out. And they had very limited time to spend with their patients, talking through fogged up goggles and shouting through a double mask. Their stories and their pain was often visible when we shared a meal in the evening. And for many of our local staff, they had suffered terribly before they came to work with. When Time did their story on Ebola workers as People of the Year, they talked to an MSF nurse, Salome Kawa. Her patients had run a medical clinic in Liberia, and she had watched the agony of them both die in front of her in a treatment center. Yet after that, as a survivor and a trainee nurse, she felt that she would be able to volunteer because her experience of being affected by Ebola and recovering meant that she was much more likely to be immune. And so when MSF asked, she stepped forward and she said, "Sitting and crying won't help me. So it's much better that I go to work. The more I interact with people, the more I will forget my sad story. So I decided to make myself very busy to help others survive." These were the stories we heard from our national staff who were living with the tragedy of their own families and their own communities, as well as supporting the many patients that we were dealing with. And for our international staff, I saw when it was time to leave, they were really torn. On one hand, they were incredibly tired and needed to go home, but then they also felt incredible guilt leaving behind our local staff and knowing that the outbreak was nowhere near being over. This is an example of the outfits, the protective gear that our staff had to wear. And I just want to highlight how long it took for them to also get out of that equipment, because that was the time when they may have been most likely to be infected. So even right at the end of their shift, every moment they were considering the risks of infection. And that brought a lot of challenge and trauma for our staff working in this very high-risk setting. But as well as all of these great challenges, there was something else that was particularly challenging about the Ebola crisis. And this was the stigma and the terrible attitudes and responses that many of our staff, both locally hired and international staff, experienced. Some MSF locally hired staff were abandoned by their partners, ejected from their homes. Their children were ostracized by playmates. We know of members who went into the community to try and educate and raise awareness or do contact tracing, who were challenged or threatened with violence by the communities because the communities were so afraid of what these people may be bringing and so afraid of Ebola. And now, many of the people who remained in Sierra Leone and Liberia, the people directly affected by the virus, their families, the medical and burial teams, can continue to suffer 10 years on from their experience during Ebola. But for MSF, ensuring the well-being of our returning staff and our staff that remain behind, both physical and mental, was of the highest importance. The impact of these attitudes were particularly visible to me as an administrator, assisting with the organisation of our international staff's return home. There was frequently unnecessary quarantine of international staff when they returned home. It was quite hard to get them home because of the lack of flights. So we couldn't get people in to take over the jobs, and we couldn't get people home when we needed to get them home. There were only 2 airlines that continued to fly, Air Maroc and Brussels Air, and we were deeply grateful to those airlines who continued to support us and enabled us to get staff to these 3 West African countries, as well as the aid, medicines, and supplies that we needed. But when people returned, they often experienced extreme discrimination. Housemates wouldn't allow them to come back to their home. Some parents-in-law were unhappy that a mum or dad was coming home and would be close to the grandchildren or their children. We saw a nurse, Sue Ellen Kovac in Australia, who had suspected Ebola when she returned, although she never tested positive. And she was forced to quarantine in a tent outside of a hospital, highlighting the fear and misinformation surrounding Ebola at the time. We know of our colleagues in the US who were shamed on television and in social media when they themselves tested positive for Ebola on returning, and others who didn't test positive nor showed any symptoms and yet were unfairly quarantined. In Australia, my home, some politicians questioned the motives of healthcare workers, saying that they were reckless or irresponsible for putting themselves in harm's way. They said that healthcare workers were seeking personal glory or attention by participating in the Ebola response efforts, rather than acknowledging their bravery and their huge contribution of going to work in the Ebola crisis. When I returned to Australia, it was extraordinary. I was first refused boarding of my aircraft, even though I had already quarantined for 3 weeks in the UK. And when I landed in Australia, I was aggressively questioned and in a room and not able to reunite with my family, even though I'd already done the full quarantine in the UK before arriving home. It was not a welcoming or friendly reception, and it did not respect and appreciate the contribution that we had made. In Australia, we stopped publishing the names and locations of our healthcare workers because we were afraid of the public response and for their safety. But alongside this, there was also incredible resilience amongst communities in the countries most affected. And there was also incredible response from many community members supporting returning international staff, and also many brave families who were incredibly supportive of their loved ones going to work in the Ebola crisis. MSF really had a unique experience during this crisis. We lost so many patients to Ebola. We had, for the first time, MSF colleagues who fell sick with Ebola. We had to turn Ebola patients away, particularly early on in the crisis. And this was heart-wrenching. We had never responded to a viral hemorrhagic fever on such a large scale in multiple countries, in multiple places simultaneously. We had to make choices that we'd never done before to divert human resources away from other emergency projects and from our headquarters on a large scale. And remember, at this time, there were still crises across the world, in South Sudan, in Ukraine, and in Syria. For the first time, we did things like ship in and set up incinerators to cremate bodies, something we'd never done, and became expert and set up specialized maternity units for women who were pregnant, who also were experiencing Ebola. We did something we hadn't done previously on this huge, large-scale knowledge transfer to other NGOs at the same time as running these huge operations. And we also began clinical trials during an outbreak. And for the very first time, when calling for worldwide support for this unprecedented epidemic, MSF's Secretary General addressed the UN member states at the UN General Assembly. MSF was pushed to the limits and beyond, and launched a response that was marked by many firsts, and many of them tragic beyond words. And so 10 years on, we reflect on what has changed. And you saw from the video at the beginning, there are things that we have learned and things that we do differently. But it's not acceptable that we do not have all of the tools in hand to deal with an epidemic should something like this happen again. It is not acceptable that the 2 approved Ebola treatments are not readily available via emergency stockpile for users in places most needed. That treatments remain under the exclusive control of just 2 US pharmaceutical corporations, despite them being developed with public funding. We shouldn't be relying on the goodwill of private corporations. It's not the solution to access to medicines. And we need to be preparing now for the next outbreak, including for other Ebola species, not only the Zaire strain, And we shouldn't have to wait until these types of epidemics reach the shores of wealthier countries before we invest in these vital treatments, not only for Ebola, but for many other neglected tropical diseases. And so 10 years on, I'm very grateful for this opportunity to reflect on the bravery of our many patients and survivors who themselves suffered extraordinary discrimination and challenges returning to their community. And I want to recognize my incredible colleagues, particularly those on the front line who were working in those high-risk settings, face-to-face with those patients from the early days and during those peaks. And it makes me incredibly proud to work for MSF and that I served during one of the most critical and pivotal moments in MSF's history. And I thank you all for attending today and sharing this experience and listening to this experience with me. Thank you.
Thank you very much for sharing your insights. So a few years ago, so we all experienced COVID pandemic, and then we were able to reflect on our experience, and then we were able to understand a bit of Ebola pandemic as well. Of course, the death rate is different. Of course, the severity is different. But in Korea, we had to quarantine ourselves, and there was stigmatization when you were contracted with the virus in the beginning. So I have a question. So when you were first dispatched, probably the Ebola virus information was not widely known. So I wonder if you were scared. So did you know how fatal it is? And I wonder how it was like you personally. You might not have had a full picture. So I would like to understand what went through your mind when you decide to go. So maybe I want to understand that process. Maybe could be a personal question. Could you answer that question?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Firstly, I was not working face-to-face with patients, and so it was clear that my risk was less than the risk of my medical colleagues who were working in the high risk zone. The other issue is I'd already worked in an epidemic context. I'd worked in Eswatini, where a country that has the highest rates of HIV and DRTB. And based on my experience with MSF in Eswatini, I had very strong trust and very high faith in MSF and in their medical protocols and in their infection control. And I felt very confident that MSF's processes would mean that to the very best of their ability, we would be protected. But they shared all of the information with us. It was very transparent, and we were all invited to make our own decisions about whether or not we traveled. But it was very important for me to be part of this response. If I don't do it, or one of the other 1,300 people who went doesn't do it, who does it? And I can do it because I understand MSF and I have something to offer and I have a trust in the organization. And so I felt a real drive to participate. But I traveled to Sierra Leone with a nurse from Japan, actually, an MSF nurse from Japan. And I remember just before we got onto the aircraft, we looked at each other and we said, "Are we ready for this?" And we nodded at each other and said, "We're ready for this." And we held hands and we got onto the aircraft. And then from that moment, I was just fully part of the team that were going there to help others. And once we got there and we got busy and we understood how it worked, many of those fears went away. But we were very careful we had to follow our protocols very strictly. And because of that, I think very few people actually were infected by Ebola, despite the huge numbers of patients that we treated. And remember, MSF treated 1/3 of all of those infected by Ebola during this crisis.
Thank you very much. As the medical staff that were facing the actual situation, you were in a different position, but you were still at the heart of the epidemic, and you did play a big part in saving lives. And making that decision, I think, would have been very challenging for you. You would have thought about it a million times. And I think, as you mentioned during your presentation, while you were working as the HR admin at the site at Sierra Leone, when you were working as an aid worker, how many staffs were available at the time? And when you were doing recruiting, what were the challenges, the main challenges? And what do you think were the most important parts, what you were looking for while recruiting?
Yeah. So there were around 500-600 people working in the Ebola Management Center, where I worked for most of my time in Sierra Leone. Obviously, one of the great challenges was finding colleagues who had the necessary skills. Already by that time, many of our local colleagues had already been impacted or infected with Ebola. There was great fear about coming forward to work. So on one hand, there was a challenge finding the right people and the right skills. Because of the particular context. But on the other hand, we needed many people to help us. One of the big challenges actually was infection control, because we were recruiting in large numbers of people, so large numbers. So we would have maybe 10 or 20 or 30 people coming each day to try and get jobs, trying to manage the crowds of people who were trying to find work with us was also an infection control challenge. When we were interviewing, ensuring that we had good infection control protocols was a big challenge, as well as all of the challenges of finding the right skills. So there was a range of challenges. And then also supporting our national staff who were really experiencing a lot of discrimination. So we would hire people to come and work with us, but they would often be rejected by their families. Their children wouldn't be allowed to play with their friends or go to schools. Sometimes their communities wouldn't let them return home. So supporting our colleagues that we recruited with those kinds of challenges as well was a very important part of our work. And of course, training all of our staff to ensure that they were properly protected and weren't at risk, particularly because many of them did not come from a medical background, had to be a huge priority. And even though we wanted to get many of these staff working as quickly as possible, we also had to make sure that they had proper training and proper preparation so that they were all safe.
Yes, thank you for that answer. I think for people who were infected and while treating such patients, that process, of course, is critical, but also tracking the route of infection. And also when we look at the local people, seeing how they came into contact with that is also critical as well. So I think doing that And I think raising that awareness as health promoter is very important. And I think that kind of information sharing would have been quite critical. I think you mentioned treatment and vaccinations during the presentation as well. We did get a question in the Q&A. For Ebola, the vaccine treatment, if we compare it against COVID, of course, it's not possible to compare it eye to eye. But I think for COVID, the vaccine was developed in an accelerated process. But for Ebola, an effective vaccine has not been developed yet. Maybe that's because of profitability. Is that the main reason? We did get this question beforehand. So unlike treatment for vaccines, in terms of profitability, has been 10 years of time, but there hasn't been an effective vaccine that has been developed. Could you share your thoughts on why?
Yeah. Look, it's not just Ebola. We know for many, many what we call neglected tropical diseases, where there isn't a huge profitable market, where those diseases are not common in high-income countries, there is no incentive in a pharmaceutical industry that is primarily driven by profit. There is no incentive for these companies to be developing vaccines and treatments and diagnostics for these diseases. And this has to change. And this is why MSF has something called the Access Campaign, where we are working with governments and we're working with pharmaceutical companies to ensure that everybody, no matter where you live or what income you or your country has an equal access and an equal right to the vaccinations, to the treatments, to the diagnostic tools that you need. And we saw in this crisis that it was only when Ebola reached the shores of the US that not only it was only when that happened did the international community start really bringing up, driving resources and sending resources to the field and significantly investing in vaccines. And that's why we're working with governments, we're working with international organizations, we're working with companies to try and change those attitudes. But I will say that Korea is a very exciting country for these types of opportunities. We have a Korean government that is much more focused on developing vaccines, diagnostics for low and middle income countries. We have a pharmaceutical industry that is much more attuned to these types of opportunities. And that's why this is going to be a very important part of my work here in Korea, because I think that Korea and Korea's pharmaceutical industry and Korea's government and NGOs such as IVI and the Wright Foundation really present the future opportunity for combating many of these neglected diseases.
Thank you so much for answering the question. And I have a follow-up question that is similar to the previous question. So as you mentioned during the presentation, Ebola treatment is controlling the stock. The US is controlling the Ebola treatment, and they're exclusively controlling it, probably to protect their own citizens. Then what would be the effective way to produce the treatment and distribute the treatment? What would be the most practical way to make that happen? So it's a question asked by one of the participants. And also, So MSF is an international humanitarian organization, but not as an organization like us, maybe from an individual point of view. Is there anything that we can do on an individual level?
So with regards to the first question, we want to end the hoarding and the control of treatments by the US. Yeah, we don't want companies to have control over these types of treatments. We're calling for an emergency stockpile that could provide doses at short notice to any country in need during an outbreak. And we want to guarantee treatments for the communities and patients who really supported the testing of these treatments. These treatments were created using public money whilst this crisis impacted people in West Africa and Central Africa. They should be the communities that are benefiting from these treatments. And one of the most effective ways of improving access to these types of treatments is through technology transfer to countries such as Korea and other countries where more of this can be produced more quickly and closer to the countries that need it. This includes technology transfer to countries in Africa so that we can produce these therapeutics and vaccines more quickly when they're needed. We know what the solutions are. The solutions are easy, but it's the willingness of governments and companies to look past profit. And we know from COVID, we know from Ebola, that these types of crises cannot be dealt with by one country. They cross borders. That's why we're called Doctors Without Borders, and they need solutions that cross borders. And one country dominating the supply of this will not deliver for the world's public health in a future crisis. What can we do individually? I think, like anything, become aware. Be aware of MSF's Access campaign. We have lots of activities, campaigns that individuals can become involved in. Support MSF, both financially and by following the work that we're doing. And of course, we're always looking for people who want to come and work for MSF as an international mobile staff, as a field worker. And what's really important, again, to highlight, it's not just medical staff we need. We need people in our offices here in Korea. Yeah, we need health promoters. You were talking about the importance of awareness in communities. We need administrators. We need logisticians. All of us contribute to fighting crises like the one that we've seen in Ebola and the many crises that we continue to see today, like in Gaza, Ukraine, Yemen, Sudan, Myanmar. So follow MSF, think about how you can get involved, and be knowledgeable, keep up to date on what's happening in public health and in our medical humanitarian responses.
Thank you so much. Executive Director also promoted the work of MSF. Thank you so much. So, and everyone who is participating in today's focus series, you now learned a lot of activities that you can participate in. And thank you so much, Emma Campbell, for that. Okay, so we have a question from a participant. I think it's someone who wants to become a field worker of MSF. So is there anything that you can share or any tips or any advice for those who want to become a field worker or an activist? And also, let's see, this person also said, so when you sign up for the field worker, what are the attitudes that we should have, and what are the skill sets that we should have? Is there a list, or is there an idea? Since Emma Campbell, you also recruited these field workers, I think you're an expert in this area. So any words that you would like to share to the Korean potential worker? So I'm not quite sure what this person is from, but maybe you can share some of the skill sets, some of the attitudes that these people need to have.
Great. Well, this is a great question because it gives me an opportunity to promote a part of a new website that we have, which is all about our recruitment for field HR. So maybe one of my colleagues can put the link in the chat, and that gives you all of the information about the types of profiles that we're looking for in MSF. And it's my job here in MSF Korea to make sure we send more Koreans to the field. And one of the reasons why it's so important for Koreans, or for me to recruit more Korean field workers, is because they bring many of the skills that we're looking for. Resilience, experience overseas, cultural competency, a cosmopolitanism and an understanding of the many crises and geographical situations that we work, being inquisitive and interested, and wanting to understand and empathize. And many of those characteristics are characteristics that I see in my Korean colleagues and are things that I love about Korea. And I think Koreans, as a generalization, have a huge amount to offer MSF. So they're some of the characteristics that I see as being very effective in the field, and they're characteristics that I see across many of my Korean colleagues in the office and friends. So if you have the actual professional skills, finance, admin, logistics, medical, I feel very confident that and you're coming to events like this, I feel very confident that you will bring many of the personal traits with you that will make you a really great field worker. See if you can speak to some field workers. It's always a great way to learn about what it's like and whether or not it would suit you.
Thank you so much. So meeting with the actual field workers, and also there is actually an opportunity where you can do that. Regularly, the MSF Korea runs events like that. We have recruitment events. So when you come to these events, you'll be able to meet the Korean field workers and you can have a chat with them. And also on our website, you'll be able to get more information about those events. So please sign up and come to these events. So today we had a focus seminar with our executive director at MSF Korea. And so coming back to today's topic, and I have a question regarding today's topic. So I would like to understand the current state of Ebola in Africa. So 10 years ago, there was the greatest outbreak in Africa. And currently, how is it? So nowadays, we don't even check COVID virus. So it's becoming an endemic. And the fatality rate of COVID-19 is low. But with Ebola, I wonder, did it become endemic? Is the mortality rate as high as 90%? Does MSF still have operation there?
So there have been some more quite serious outbreaks of Ebola in the DRC and also which is traditionally the location where MSF has worked with Ebola. It's the place where most Ebola outbreaks have happened historically. But there was also in 2022 to 2023 a major Ebola outbreak in Uganda. And in both of those instances, or in all of those instances, MSF was a major responder. But again, many of the people who were impacted during those outbreaks did not have access to the treatment that they should have had access to. And this is simply unacceptable. So we will continue to see outbreaks of Ebola. And unless we want to see a situation similar to what we saw in West Africa, we need to ensure that we have all of the tools available to support patients and to ensure that they have the care that they need and the care that they rightfully deserve.
Thank you so much. So since 2014, which was at the peak of Ebola outbreak, and there were 3 countries that the virus was affecting. So we didn't have that scale of an outbreak yet. However, it seems like that we are still seeing Ebola outbreaks here and there in Africa. So it seems like it's an ongoing. So MSF is making sure that this Ebola pandemic doesn't become the scale of 2004, that of the 2014. So we are working very hard to contain the outbreak. So it's time to wrap up. So I actually have a question for Emma Campbell. The one last question. So you worked in Sierra Leone to contain the disease, but you also worked in Eswatini, Turkey, and Liberia. You worked in other areas, Lebanon. You also worked in other areas as well. So when you compare your experiences in other areas, what was different about the Ebola outbreak? You mentioned about those psychological treatment or support given to the staff members, the medical staff members during the Ebola operation. And also you mentioned about when they went back to their own country, even the families didn't want to, felt scared to meet their staff members. So of course, the patients themselves, when they were infected with Ebola, they were stigmatized and they couldn't go back to their community sometimes. The families couldn't freely meet with them. So I understand that was the situation, what happened with Ebola outbreak. So when you think about the situation in other countries, I think Ebola outbreak might have been a bit different. So would you say Ebola operation was uniquely different? And also, for those people who want to work in the field in the future, participate in Ebola outbreak operations, like, is there any final words that you would like to share with them?
So for your first question, each of my missions was very extraordinary and special, sad and wonderful in very different ways. In Eswatini, MSF was making a huge impact on the whole country, given the terrible death rate from HIV and TB. And of course, in Lebanon and Turkey, we were there responding to the war in Syria, which was also a response on a huge scale. So it's quite hard to compare missions because each one of them was a real privilege for me to work in and has had a lasting impact. But there was something particular about the Ebola outbreak. The first, as I've talked about, was the attitudes to people who returned home. Normally, when MSF staff come home, we're welcomed and really celebrated. And this wasn't the case always with Ebola. But the other thing was, as an HR practitioner, the one thing that you want is that your staff come home safely, that nothing happens to them. And during the Ebola crisis, there was that constant worry that your colleagues might be infected. And unfortunately, some of them were, and I dealt with some of those situations. And that was something that was very unique. And something that I hope I don't have to deal with in any future situation. And lastly, all my missions, but particularly the response of MSF as an organization to Ebola, really makes me incredibly proud to work for this organization and enables me to stand up in front of all of you and ask for support, financial and other ways, and ask you to think about joining, because I know it's a great organization and I know the contribution that it's made and continues to make. And I feel very lucky to have been that one person in the 1,300 people who went and made a small contribution. And I feel very lucky to be here in Korea, in the country that I love, in an organization I love, continuing to share the work of MSF. And thank you all for all your support and turning up tonight to listen to my presentation. Thanks. Thanks, Ji Hyun as well.
Thank you so much. So March was the 10th year commemorative year since the Ebola outbreak. And thank you so much, Emma Campbell, for taking time to share your experience with us on this occasion. And also, in a way, Ebola is not a well-known disease in Korea, but thank you so much for everyone who participated in this webinar. Although it's not a widely known issue in Korea. So in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, it has shocked the world. We have all been reminded that the spread of infectious diseases in one country is not just the country's matter. We learned that we shouldn't turn a blind eye just because it's not happening where we live, but we should treat it as a challenge that we should address together. Humanitarian crises are occurring far away. However, there are many humanitarian workers, MSF activists, field workers who run to those places. And also there are people like you who participated today and support MSF. I would like to thank you everyone for your support. If you have any other questions about MSF today, or if you have any other further questions about our work, operation, or careers and opportunities, please visit our website at msf.or.kr and email us and we will connect with you. Thank you so much, everyone, for participating in today's focus series, and I'll meet you at the next focus briefing.